She was dying slowly, like a tree rotting from the inside, eaten away by worms. The stench rising from her bed was so thick that the torchbearers in the corridor tried to keep the flames away from the doors, fearing that the smell of sulfur and decay would mix with the smoke and cause the courtiers to vomit. Those who still dared to enter whispered to each other the queen had poisoned herself, and not out of fear of God's coming judgment, but because she knew that in the eyes of the Lord she was already condemned. She had made a sacrifice that could not be spoken of aloud, and this sacrifice, made for the sake of the French crown, was now dragging her soul into the abyss. Only 3 people knew the secret of what had happened many years before these last few weeks. 2 of them had long since been laid to rest, one in a monastery cemetery, the other in an unmarked grave, in an old cemetery. The third, a grey, skeletal old man, the Queen's former confessor, still wandered the palace corridors like a shadow, praying quietly as the guards passed by. His prayers were not for salvation, but for oblivion. The servants claimed that the illness had come on suddenly. One night, the Queen woke up screaming. It was as if a flame had burst in her throat. Her tongue was swollen, and her lips had turned dark. The court physician examined her by candlelight and ordered that an infusion of marsh roots be prepared immediately and poured down her throat. By morning, dark spots appeared on the skin of her neck, resembling burn marks, and the veins in her arms began to swell and show through like bluish ropes. The Palace Chronicles record this moment dryly. In the summer of the year of our Lord 1546, in the month of September, the Queen began to have a fever, accompanied by an exhausting blood disorder. But in the notes of one of the ladies-in-waiting, found many years later, the words are much harsher. She smelled like meat, forgotten in the sun on a hot day, and when she breathed, steam came from her lips as if from an open wound. By order of the king, strangers were forbidden to enter her chambers, but he himself rarely visited her, and only to make sure she was still alive. Not out of love, their union had long been political, but out of fear that her death before the end of the autumn council meeting could cause a riot among the nobility. The old ducal families were waiting for her departure as a convenient excuse to regain their influence. The younger ones, promoted by the king himself, feared that after her death, the old order would return. The doctors resorted to what they considered the best remedies of the time. They applied leeches, performed bloodletting, and rubbed her body with ointments made from crushed herbs mixed with wine and pork fat. She was given opium to relieve her convulsions, but it made her fall asleep and delirious, shouting out the names of long-dead people. Sometimes she began to pray quietly, but soon her prayers turned into whispers in which the ladies-in-waiting recognized fragments of confessions about a child who had been sacrificed for the glory of France. By this time, her face had changed beyond recognition. Her skin had taken on a grayish-green hue, her cheekbones were sunken, and her eyes were filled with cloudy moisture. A sore opened on her right cheek, oozing pus. She was turned over in bed several times a day to prevent the rot from spreading, but the sheets were still soaked with stains. The servants wrapped the linen in cloths to prevent the smell from spreading throughout the palace. During those weeks, a quiet but fierce battle raged around the dying woman's bed. The cardinal, the king's closest advisor, tried to place his trusted physician in her chambers to record her every word. and perhaps obtain a confession that could be used against the disgraced family. At the same time, the senior ducal clan bribed one of the ladies-in-waiting, hoping to find out to whom she might bequeath her jewels and titles. Relations between Catholics and secret supporters of reform became particularly tense during those days. For some, she remained God's anointed one, suffering from the devil's poison. For others, she was an instrument of tyranny that had received its just deserts. Pilgrims gathered at the palace gates, singing psalms and begging to be allowed to see the dying woman, to pray for her soul. But the guards kept the gates locked. By the end of the third week, the disease began to consume her strength more quickly. She stopped eating, and the doctors began to pour warm milk with honey into her mouth, but it ran down her chin. Cracks appeared on her lips, and every sip was accompanied by a groan. One night, her cry woke half the palace. She screamed that she saw a child standing at the foot of her bed, and that his eyes were burning so brightly that even the candles were going out. The notes of the court chaplain of those days note, "The face of Her Majesty bears the mark of death. Her heart beats slowly and heavily, her breathing is labored, her spirit is poisoned. The servants avoid approaching her, fearing not so much the stench as her eyes, which are filled with unrest." But political affairs could not wait for her death. The council was already discussing who would become regent if the king died without her. Ambassadors from Spain and England sent reports home, stating that France was on the verge of change. By the end of the month, the doctors admitted that the poison she had taken had destroyed her insides. But no one knew when the end would come, and she was still alive, clinging to her pillows like a drowning man to a log, and seemed to be waiting for something or someone. By morning, her hands had turned into dry, bloodless branches with blue joints. The skin on her fingers had cracked in places, and a dark, viscous liquid oozed from the cracks, slowly forming a crust. The doctors cauterized these areas with red-hot iron, believing that this would lock the poison inside and prevent it from penetrating deeper. But each procedure caused her to convulse, and after each cauterization, she lost consciousness. Visiting restrictions were tightened. Now even some of the ladies-in-waiting who had served her since her youth stood in the corridor, clutching the door handle and crying. But they were not allowed in. The official version was that Her Majesty's condition is unstable and requires complete rest. The unofficial version was that she might reveal in her delirium the names of those who had helped her ascend to the throne at the cost of someone else's life. Night after night, she whispered about the sacrifice, not as an event of the past, but as if it were happening again and again. Sometimes the ladies-in-waiting claimed that she was talking to someone invisible who was accusing her of murder. One of the young servants who overheard this delirium fled the palace and, according to rumors, later told tavern patrons that the Queen saw the face of the child she herself had ordered to be brought to the Abbey dungeons. Doctors came and went, but no one could alleviate her condition. Leeches were no longer applied. They could find no blood. Bloodletting only weakened her further. Now the main treatment consisted of rubbing her with foul-smelling oils to mask the stench coming from under the blankets. The smell was so bad that even experienced servants accustomed to wounds and disease turned away. Meanwhile, outside her chambers, the council was divided into two camps. Some insisted that the Queen should sign her will immediately while she was still able to hold a pen. so that her property and titles would go to loyal allies. Others feared that any mention of a will would hasten her end. Rumors spread that she had not taken the poison herself, but had been persuaded to do so by the king, who wanted to get rid of his overly independent wife. The cardinal, who gained access to her chambers under the pretext of prayer, wrote down every word. His notes read, "She asked for water, but when I brought her the cup, she turned away and said, 'Don't give it to me. It's poison too.' Her eyes were glassy, her breathing heavy. The corners of her mouth were black, and her lips were cracked and bleeding. All this was happening against a backdrop of alarming news from the provinces. In Burgundy, peasants were refusing to pay taxes, citing signs in the form of the Queen's death. In Lyon, preachers were already calling her death God's judgment for the bloody decisions she had made in the early years of her reign. By the beginning of the 4th week, her body had become a source of constant fever. Her forehead was burning, but her hands and feet remained ice cold. Her breathing became hoarse, and her chest bubbled. When she fell asleep, it seemed as if her heart had stopped, but after a moment, it began to beat again, pushing her into a semi-conscious state. During the night, one of the doctors decided on a risky procedure. He inserted a wooden wedge into her throat and tried to clear the coating that was preventing her from swallowing. This caused a violent coughing fit with blood and pieces of dark mucus. After that, she lay unconscious for several hours, and everyone thought she had died. But at dawn, she opened her eyes again and whispered, "He has come. He is standing at the door." That night, something strange was noticed at the palace gates. Dozens of people, many barefoot, were kneeling and praying, holding candles in their hands. None of them had seen the Queen for a month, but rumors of her suffering had spread throughout Paris. Some asked God to forgive her, others to take her away quickly. The council understood that every day of delay was dangerous. If she died suddenly, without signing the necessary papers, power would pass to people whom the current advisors considered enemies. And so, in the corridors of the palace, there were increasing whispers that perhaps her death should be helped along. She herself, as if sensing all this, clung to life with frightening determination. Her face was almost skeletal. The skin on her neck was sagging, and dark veins stood out on her forehead. But her eyes, cloudy and red from inflammation, sometimes flashed coldly when one of her enemies approached her bed. By the end of the 5th week, it was impossible to stay in the chambers without feeling dizzy. The smell of rotting flesh, sour, sweaty skin, and tarry ointments mixed into a suffocating, sticky air that the candles could barely pierce with their faint light. Even the guards, accustomed to carnage and wounds, averted their eyes when the doors opened and the gust of air carried the smell to them. Her body no longer belonged to her. Her face was black around the eyes. Her lips were cracked and exposed her teeth, which were covered in places with a yellow film. Her cheeks were sunken. The skin on her temples had become transparent, and thin veins were clearly visible beneath it. 2 deep bed sores had opened on her back, oozing yellow fluid. The doctors covered them with crushed shells and sprinkled them with powdered dried herbs. But this did not stop the smell. She began to delirium constantly. She spoke to someone whom no one else could see. Sometimes her lips barely moved, but fragments of phrases were understandable. "Don't scream. You're already gone. I gave them their blood." The ladies in waiting stopped approaching her at night without guards. They said that in the dark, her eyes glowed and her words did not sound like the speech of a living person. During those days, only 3 people were allowed to enter her chambers: the chief physician, the cardinal, and the captain of the guard. The king appeared only twice a week and left immediately if she started talking. Rumors circulated that he was afraid that her delirium would reveal something that could not be hidden from the council. Outside the chambers, there was an open war of intrigue. The cardinal tried to convince the king to hasten her end, explaining that a slow death was destroying the prestige of his power. The old ducal families, on the contrary, wanted her to live at least a few more weeks so that they could conclude the necessary marriages and treaties. Letters from foreign ambassadors of the time contained chilling descriptions. The Queen's fate seems to be sealed. The poison is working slowly but surely. There is no strength in her body, no life in her face, but hatred sometimes flashes in her eyes. This is dangerous for those who are still connected to her. One night, an unknown person entered the Queen's chambers. The servant on duty at the door swore that he saw a figure in a black cloak, leaning over her bed and whispering something in her ear. The next morning, she woke up in terror, demanding that all the candles be extinguished and screaming that he was now waiting for her behind the wall. The doctors were at their wits' end. One suggested giving her a poisonous root infusion to end her suffering. Another wanted to take her to a convent where she could cleanse her soul with prayer. The king rejected both suggestions, fearing that she would make a dangerous confession to a monk before she died. The Queen's internal organs were barely functioning. She could not keep food down and moaned from the pain in her stomach. Her belly swelled, but her arms and legs became thin, like a skeleton. Her breathing was labored, and with each breath, the sound of fluid sloshing in her lungs could be heard. A dark coating appeared on her tongue, and each word was difficult to utter. Meanwhile, stories about her past were spreading throughout Paris. That on her way to the throne, she had renounced her own child, giving him up for a secret sacrifice in the dungeons of a monastery. It was said that this was a condition for her alliance with one of the powerful families, without which the crown would have remained out of reach. These rumors were supported by the king's enemies, and each new story about her suffering was taken as confirmation of God's punishment. The chaplain, the only one who still prayed at her bedside, wrote in his notes, "She looks terrible, but her words are even worse. She calls her child by name and says she can hear him laughing in the hallway. I, a sinner, also heard footsteps at night when we were alone." By the beginning of the 7th week, it was clear that she was nearing the end. But those who were waiting for her death understood that she could still take too many secrets with her. And so the question was no longer whether she would die, but who would be the first to seize the moment of her passing. The Queen's last days turned into a long siege of her bed. Her body was almost unresponsive to touch. The skin on her hands had become waxy and cold, and her joints were frozen in a half-bent position. The smell of decay and iron emanated from her mouth, and every word was a barely audible whisper. The doctors said that her heart was still beating, but her strength was fading with every passing hour. There were now 2 chairs in the chamber, one for the senior physician and the other for the cardinal. The captain of the guard sat right by the door so that no one could enter without permission. The windows were tightly curtained. The candles smoked, and their shadows flickered on the walls, as if something unearthly was happening around the bed. The council no longer hid the fact that they were waiting for her death. Some demanded that the chaplain take her last confession, supposedly for the salvation of her soul. But those who knew her better understood that any confession could be used as a weapon. The king hesitated. He wanted her dead, but he feared that her last words would reach the ears of his enemies. During those days, her delirium became continuous. She called out the name of the child she had allegedly sacrificed, begged for forgiveness, and claimed that he was standing at the door, dressed in white, but with black eyes. The ladies in waiting wept and begged to be allowed to leave the palace, but they were forbidden to leave so that the rumors would not get out. On the night before her death, something strange happened in the palace. Around midnight, a guard at the door swore that he heard footsteps in the empty corridor and the quiet laughter of a child. He threw open the door, but there was no one there. When he returned, the queen looked straight at him with cloudy eyes and whispered, "You saw him." The next day, a confessor was admitted to her chambers, but his visit was quickly interrupted. According to witnesses, she began her confession, but when she reached the moment of the sacrifice, she suddenly screamed so loudly that she was heard in the next room. The cardinal ordered the monk to be taken away immediately, fearing that his words would be spread throughout the city. In the evening, her condition deteriorated sharply. Doctors tried to give her an infusion of wine and herbs, but she was suffocating, wheezing, and foaming at the mouth with blood. Her breathing became ragged, and her eyes rolled back. It seemed that death was already here, but she still lived through another night, lying motionless, only occasionally moving her lips. She opened her eyes for the last time in the morning. The chaplain, who was sitting nearby, later said that she uttered only one word, the name of her child. Then, her breathing became quiet, almost imperceptible, and her heart stopped. At that moment, the doors of the chambers were slammed shut, and the guards let no one in. The hasty preparation of the body began. The smell was so strong that the embalmers could hardly stand it as they smeared the skin with a mixture of oils and wax. The sheets and clothes were burned in the courtyard, and the water used to wash the body was ordered to be poured outside the city. News of her death spread through Paris faster than the messengers could leave the palace. Crowds gathered at the gates. Some prayed, others shouted that God had punished her. Bells rang in churches, but in some parishes, the priests refused to say a funeral mass. The council convened that same day. The struggle for power began immediately. Some demanded immediate marriages and alliances. Others demanded the repeal of previous decrees. The king declared mourning, but behind the scenes, he decided how to destroy or hide all records of her last weeks. In letters from foreign ambassadors, her death was described as the end of an era and the beginning of disintegration. The Spanish rejoiced at France's weakening, and the English were already preparing new negotiations. And the people continued to tell stories about the queen, whose crown had been bought at the price of sacrifice, and about how her spirit, together with her child, still roamed the corridors of the old palace. The Queen's death did not bring peace to France. Just a day after the funeral, which was held in a closed coffin, rumors began to spread in the capital that her body had been secretly burned, and a wax figure had been placed in the coffin to hide traces of poison and decay. These rumors were fueled by her enemies, while her supporters tried to hush them up, but the poison had already been spilled. The council was divided. The ducal families who had been waiting for her death during her lifetime immediately began to put their people forward for key positions. The king's young favorites resisted, but their positions were shaky. The cardinal, who held her secret confessions in his hands, disappeared from the palace on the third day after the funeral and never reappeared in Paris. Rumor had it that he had taken with him a chest containing records and correspondence that could disgrace half the nobility. The king, formerly left without a wife, behaved coldly and aloofly. He ordered the destruction of all the queen's personal belongings, including letters, clothes, and even portraits. The portrait hanging in the throne room was taken down and burned in the courtyard under the watchful eye of the guards. But this only served to engrave her image more deeply in the memory of the people. In the streets of Paris, her name was now whispered, but always in connection with the story of her sacrifice. In the markets, old women told children that she had paid for the crown with the blood of a baby, and that now the child's soul would not let her rest in either this world or the next. Some swore that they had seen a figure in white at the palace windows and heard children's laughter at night. In the provinces, however, the Queen's death had quite different consequences. Unrest broke out in Normandy and Burgundy. Local rulers took advantage of the chaos to refuse taxes and expand their powers. In Lyon, reformers openly celebrated her demise, calling it a victory of the true faith over tyranny. Noble marriages, broken by the Queen's illness, were now hastily arranged to secure alliances. Old enemies of the king, who had long remained in the shadows, began to appear at council meetings, declaring that they had returned to serve their country. Each of them had their own scores to settle with the deceased, and now sought to grab a piece of power. The funeral held in the royal tomb was strange. There were no lavish processions or cries from the people, just a few priests, guards, and a closed coffin. But the chronicles recorded that at the moment when it was lowered into the crypt, one of the servants' torches went out without a breeze. The servants crossed themselves, and the chaplain quietly whispered a prayer for protection from unclean spirits. A month after her death, a new rumor broke out in Paris. Allegedly, one of the embalmers who had participated in preparing the body said that he had seen a cross-shaped burn on the Queen's chest and that fluid continued to ooze from the wounds on her back even after her death. He was quickly arrested, but the rumor had already spread through taverns and markets. On the international stage, the Queen's death weakened France. The Spanish and English ambassadors immediately offered new treaties, imposing conditions on the king that would have been unacceptable during her lifetime. In some letters from foreign diplomats, her death was called the moment when the heart of France was opened to the knife. The few who had been close to her in her final weeks went their separate ways. The senior physician left for the provinces and never returned to court. The cardinal remained in exile, but rumors claimed that he continued to collect documents about her accession to the throne. The chaplain, the only one who saw her at the moment of her death, soon died under mysterious circumstances. He was found in his cell with his neck broken, and the case was quickly closed as an accident. Years passed, but her name continued to stir people's minds. For some, she remained a symbol of cruelty and treachery, for others, a victim of her own ambition. But everyone agreed on one thing. Her death marked the beginning of a new period of instability, when the royal power wavered with every rumor and whisper, and in the dark corridors of the old palace, where her bed once stood, guards taking turns still sometimes swore that they heard the soft footsteps of a child at night. And every time, they tried not to look toward the closed door of the former royal chambers.